Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for March 24, 2022, the Corporate and Regulatory Failure Edition. And we begin with that story from the Wall Street Journal as the former Boeing pilot accused of lying to the FAA has been found not guilty in a 737 MAX criminal trial in Fort Worth. The jury deliberated only 2 hours, which tells you that the jury found nothing the government put on persuasive. And the jury, one of the jurors, said that the government ultimately provided very little support to its position that Faulkner intentionally sought to deceive the FAA, and we saw it more as a corporate and regulatory failure of communication. So, what we have here is a failure of communication and no guilty verdicts whatsoever in the 737 MAX case. Not a good look for the government. Next up, also from the Wall Street Journal, the trial judge has lifted the first monitorship for ZTE in his probation for violations of U.S. sanctions. And the federal judge ended the 5-year supervision of a Dallas lawyer who has had a very controversial reign. This was the first settlement with GTE. It was the $950 million settlement. The second settlement, after the Trump Justice Department said that ZTE had violated the first settlement, was $1 billion with a 10-year monitorship. That monitorship is still in place. Next up, from Law 360, an article about the feds allegedly tracing some $35 million in kickbacks to Roger Ng and his family as a part of the 1MDB trial. The article, which unfortunately is behind a paywall, I should say, details the number of shell companies involved, and not even the government could really get through all of these. So I think it's going to be really difficult for the government to get a conviction of him, given the testimony of Timothy Leisner. If the jury chooses not to believe him, which would certainly be within their purview, there's not a lot of other evidence directly tying Roger Ng to this matter. And finally, in the FirstEnergy shareholder derivative action, the plaintiff's lawyers have released the names of the persons who allegedly orchestrated and paid the bribes from FirstEnergy to Ohio legislators, and that was the former CEO and former SVP. They had refused to give this information, and they were really given a lot of grief by the court. It's a huge procedural mess. So we got the allegations of who led the bribery scheme at FirstEnergy. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.